Hello, right. Welcome to another video podcast. Today we're going to be in this video podcast. We're going to be talking about the different sulci and the gyri and different structures which are visible on the medial surface of the cerebral hemispheres. The lobes of the hemispheres might not be that clearly defined on the medial side. However, still there are many important structures that should be recognized. So let's start with this structure over here, which is kind of C-shaped in its appearance. This is known as the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum is the largest commissure of the brain and forms quite a striking feature on the medial surface over here. And when we say commissure, what does a commissure mean? Well, commissure basically means white matter tract fibers or the axons which connect the two sides of the brain. So these are horizontally running white matter tract fibers which are crossing the midline connecting the two hemispheres, and we've cut them in the middle at the in a mid sagittal plane where the midline sagittal fissure was present, and so you can actually see the cut section of those fibers over here. The corpus callosum can be divided anatomically into its four subparts, and we'll talk about that in much more detail in some subsequent video when we talk about the commissures. But at least let's just identify those parts over here. So anteriorly over here, this bend or the bended part of the corpus callosum, this is known as the genu. Genu technically means an angle. So this is the angular part of corpus callosum. The genu continues down as this horizontal flat part, which is known as the rostrum of the corpus callosum. So we've got rostrum followed by this angular part called genu. Genu continues backwards as this body, and the body has a bumpy tail, which is known as the splenium of the corpus callosum. And you can probably appreciate a bit of a space present over here inside the hemisphere. This is known as the lateral ventricle, and we're looking at the lateral ventricle in the left cerebral hemisphere. The corpus callosum, you can probably appreciate that it forms the anterior wall and the roof of the lateral ventricle, and we'll talk about that in detail in some subsequent video. The reason why you can't really see the cavity of lateral ventricle is because here we've got a flat sheet-like structure over here called septum pellucidum, which is forming the medial wall of the lateral ventricle and kind of extending from the rostrum and the genu all the way to the body of corpus callosum. If I poke a hole over here, then I'm basically going to go into the cavity of the lateral ventricle, and this is probably what has been done over here as well. See, the septum pellucidum is broken a little bit here. So that's the first striking feature which we can see on the medial side, which is the corpus callosum. Now, the second structure which we can talk about is another C-shaped structure which is surrounding the corpus callosum, and that is known as the cingulate gyrus. Now, this is a gyrus, so this is basically gray matter, unlike the corpus callosum, which was white matter. The cingulate gyrus begins beneath the anterior end of the corpus callosum. So right over here, this is the anterior part of corpus callosum, and this is the cingulate gyrus beginning over here, and it continues above the corpus callosum until it reaches all the way to its posterior end. The cingulate gyrus and kind of goes up like that. So that's basically the cingulate gyrus. The gyrus is separated from the corpus callosum by this sulcus. Remember, sulcus is a depression. So this sulcus here, this is known as the callosal sulcus. The cingulate gyrus is kind of sandwiched between the two sulci. One of them is the callosal sulcus, which we just said was separating the corpus callosum from cingulate gyrus, and the other sulcus above it is the cingulate sulcus, which you can see all around the cingulate gyrus here. The cingulate sulcus basically separates the cingulate gyrus from this gyrus here, which is the superior frontal gyrus. Now, the reason why I have this lateral view of the cerebral hemisphere, even though we're describing the medial surface, is because I just wanted to do a bit of a recap of the gyri which we discussed in a previous video when we were talking about the frontal lobe and the lateral side of the frontal lobe. And if you guys remember, we said that there are two important sulci on the lateral surface of the frontal lobe, and those were the superior frontal sulcus and the inferior frontal sulcus. And consequently, there were three gyri here: the inferior frontal gyrus, the middle frontal gyrus, and then the superior frontal gyrus. This superior frontal gyrus extends onto the medial side as well, and then it is separated from, it is kind of limited over here by the cingulate sulcus, which separates the superior frontal gyrus from the cingulate gyrus. So just wanted to correlate the structure, the superior frontal gyrus on the medial side, with its remaining continuation on the lateral side. Now, lastly, in this video, we can talk about another structure called the paracentral lobule, which is basically the area of the cerebral cortex that surrounds the indentation produced by the central sulcus on the superior border, right? So this gyrus, this U-shaped gyrus, this is basically paracentral lobule, and you can see it is limited posteriorly by the cingulate sulcus, which was around the cingulate gyrus and kind of gets upturned like this over here to form the posterior extent of the paracentral lobule, which was clasping the central sulcus. Now, once again, we're going to resort to to the lateral view, and if you remember, in one of the previous video podcasts, we talked about a sulcus called the central sulcus, extending from the lateral sulcus all the way up to the superior margin of the cerebral cortex. This central sulcus, although it's present mainly on the lateral surface, but it extends a little bit onto the medial side as well. And this is where you can see the central sulcus here. This is then limited by the paracentral lobule. So what would be the so let's just go back to the lateral view over here. Remember, we said that in front of the central sulcus, we've got a sulcus called precentral sulcus, and behind it, we've got a sulcus called postcentral sulcus. Between the central sulcus and the precentral sulcus, we had a precentral gyrus, the primary motor area, and we had the postcentral gyrus behind, which is the primary sensory area. The precentral gyrus extends on the medial side in front of the central sulcus. So literally the anterior part of paracentral lobule is basically the continuation of the precentral gyrus. The postcentral gyrus then continues behind the central sulcus here on the medial side and forms the posterior part of the paracentral lobule. So paracentral lobule is nothing but a piece of a gyrus, which is gray matter, and is clasping the central sulcus, and anteriorly is formed. It's basically the continuation of the precentral gyrus, and posteriorly it is basically the continuation of the postcentral gyrus. So to summarize, in this video, we have talked basically about some structures on the medial surface of cerebral cortex. We started with a white matter commissure, which was the corpus callosum, and then we talked about the gyri, such as the cingulate gyrus, which is clasping the corpus callosum, and we talked about something called the paracentral lobule, which is clasping the central sulcus and is basically a continuation of precentral gyrus anteriorly and postcentral gyrus posteriorly.